Welcome. I'm delighted to be the moderator for this next session at the Centre Court MBA Festival, where we'll be taking a truly candid look at the power and the pitfalls of MBA rankings, how they might shape school strategy, student decision-making, and the broader perception of program quality. Now, rankings are often one of the first things that prospective students might check out as they explore business schools. And in the past month, my scroll on LinkedIn, it's been a blizzard. You could hardly miss them with Bloomberg, QS, LinkedIn itself, all publishing results. But behind those glossy league tables, many questions. And for you, our viewers, no doubt many questions. And after this thought-provoking discussion, I encourage you to go into the Centre Court lobby and connect and network and chat with others, share your opinions about the rankings. And of course, you can catch up with some of the other previous recordings through this festival. Now, how are we going to unpack business school rankings? We're joined by three exceptional leaders from some of the world's most respected business schools. From the London Business School, Graham Hastie, he's the Associate Dean of Degree Education. Mary Carr, the Dean of the Welch Management Institute, and from the Yale School of Management, Gabrielle Rossi, the Associate Dean for Faculty and Curriculum. Thank you, all three of us, to be here for this feisty subject. From your perspectives, perhaps Graham, starting with you, what do schools really think about rankings, and does it impact strategy and resource allocation?
So, good evening, Matt, and thanks very much for the invitation. What do schools really think about rankings? I mean, gosh, that's a tricky one to start with.
It's a public recording.
I think rankings, we love them and hate them. I think schools have a quixotic relationship with them. We love to criticize the methodology. We love to comment as to how they don't apply to us. But ultimately, because our consumers, our students, and our alumni, and our prospective students look at rankings, we do care. We do care where we come in the ranking, as much as we might be able to justify why we don't do as well as we should. I think the rankings do matter because they matter to the people that choose to come to schools, and we know that they get information from them. So they matter. We probably downplay them, but they are important. I don't think they really impact on strategy. I would be interested to hear from others, but I think they're always there in the front or back of mind, depending on how you've done.
Right. Well, perhaps turning to you, Mary, and of course at the Welch Management Institute, you've had this steady success through Princeton Review and other rankings, which must be rewarding to see over a period of time. So what do you think about the rankings?
Yes, thank you. I agree with Graham in that we definitely respect the rankings. We do our best not to chase them, right? And from a strategy standpoint, we're always looking at how we are delivering value to our students at JWMI. And, our students are working adults. And so how do we bring our MBA experience to someone who's working full-time in an asynchronous environment? And so it's always about delivering that value and that ROI for that specific student. That really is what our strategy is all about. But we definitely we look at the rankings as a lens and as one data set, and we like the rankings at Poets and Quants because so much of it is based off of student feedback, and that really aligns with our mission at JWMI.
Right. Well, perhaps the panelists will agree with each other, even if we don't always agree with the rankings. But Gabrielle, your turn. What you think about the rankings and how it might, impact on the strategy of a business school?
Yeah, I mean, I quite agree with Graham and Mary's take on things. I think that this question about do the rankings matter, and in some sense, of course they matter, because so long as the rankings matter to candidates and students and alumni, they're going to matter to schools. In that sense, they continue to be an important signal, and we continue to engage with them. But that is not an endorsement of specific methodologies. And since I think we're going to be going there anyways, I might as well kick it off a little bit to to cast a few complaints about the methodologies that are employed by the rankings. They're oftentimes, for instance, misaligned with practice or hastily implemented or too filled with noise to deliver useful signals to folks. And the ordinal ranks in particular, I think, are problematic in that different students have different needs from an MBA program, and there's so much more to determining the best fit. So, I think our views are roughly similar in the sense that these are signals people care about, our constituents care about, and so we care about them. We pay close attention to them. We engage with them, but we also would love to have more influence over the methodologies and weight.
Well, Gabrielle, I'll stay with you. We're just on the back of a session at Centre Court where we were looking at the impact of AI, both in terms of curriculum, upskilling, the future of work. And I wonder if rankings distort that core mission. We think about the reward of innovation. Does it discourage schools from innovating if they'd be better served by conforming to the metrics of a ranking?
That could be true. I mean, it's hard for me really to speak to schools broadly. In Yale's case, I don't think that that's the case. I mean, while we do care about rankings, they don't really factor into our strategic plans. We need to rely on feedback from our students and faculty and alumni and employers. And we have our own networks and approaches for benchmarking and evaluating innovations in new programming. And so schools are quite nuanced. That's why I don't kind of assume to speak for any larger crowd, but they're quite nuanced, and we need to focus on the needs of our own communities and programs when considering interventions and innovations. And the rankings aren't that particularly helpful in that regard, at least in our case.
Right.
And of course, we need to focus on our mission. Our own mission needs to be the center of all of these things.
There's an editor sitting somewhere in London or in Washington, Graham, and saying, I think we should be measuring this. And then you're faced with, perhaps an evolving methodology. So again, this sense of being true to your mission as a school, do you think that rankings do discourage that with the pressure to then perform around these different metrics?
I think it's an interesting question. I don't think ultimately they do. I mean, I have heard from editors of various journals that the rankings are, if you like, a way of pressuring schools to think in different ways. I'm not sure that they do change fundamentally what we do and what our faculty teach in the class. Fundamentally, we want to bring in world-class students, want to give them a world-class experience and help them find world-class opportunities when they leave our school. Some of the things that the rankings measure about international diversity, about gender diversity, these are things that matter to us anyway in that context. The rankings more recently have evolved to measure sustainability and ESG. That's also something that's on our minds. Ultimately, if 100% of our courses contained elements of ESG, we would score maximum points in that ranking. But we think business education is about more than just that. So I'm not sure that they act as a sort of reward for innovation. Equally, I'm not sure that they discourage it. I'm not sure that I'm just not sure that they have a huge impact on the sorts of things that we do and a massive impact on our strategies. But again, like Gabrielle, I can't propose to speak for all schools.
Right. Now, with the metrics that you've mentioned, of course, Graham, that would refer to the FT and their particular methodology. Perhaps back to you, Mary, just in terms of this emphasis that you've placed on the student experience. So do you as a school dive into those methodologies and say, what matters to us, and therefore the rankings will participate in that is best going to reflect who we are as an institution?
Absolutely. When looking at different rankings to participate in, because so much of our focus is all about the student and student centric, from flexibility, affordability to the programs that we offer. And it's adult learners. We have this learn today, apply tomorrow philosophy, and then come back and tell us about it on Friday. Our students are an integral part of both informing the curriculum through their survey data that they complete for us, probably in their minds too much. But that helps inform how we build our program. And so they're very much a part of it. There's very much a pay it forward philosophy when you're a student here. And I think that when we choose surveys to participate in or rankings to participate in, it has to align with that philosophy. So for example, JWMI doesn't practice tenure. If tenure is part of the methodology, it doesn't make sense for JWMI to participate in that ranking methodology. We're going to lean on surveys that really heavily weight student feedback and the student experience, because that is what we drive, and that's what we seek growth and improvement upon, quarter after quarter. So some surveys just wouldn't make sense and that's important for the students to think about when they're considering different rankings. Is it's good for them to understand the methodology, to see what aligns with you, where you are in the moment.
Right. Perhaps good just to emphasize something that all of you have said of your personal comments and how they might reflect your individual institutions. We're not talking for an entire industry. Gabrielle, I was at an annual Dean's conference, and there was one of those live surveys where I think you could QR scan and then reply which of the rankings you thought was the most reliable, the most trustworthy. I don't know how many of us in the room and how statistically reliable and significant we were as a group. But for you, is there a ranking that you think is more reliable, more trustworthy than the others?
Well, it's a difficult question. I mean, on the one hand, a ranking like the P&Q composite offers reliability in the sense that it's a composite rank, and so it averages, or not really averages, but it applies some sort of weighting to different ranks, and so that people get a sense of relatively how different programs compare. But I think in general, the rankings have a problem in that they're often or always published as an ordinal rank. And I think with ordinal ranks, any kind of ordinal ranking, you get all sorts of different issues. It could be, is there really a statistically significant variance between 1 and 2? And there's all of these different categories of things that folks measure. I think some rankings are much more complicated. You mentioned the FT. I think the FT has a particularly overly complicated ranking system, and they apply weights according to their own sensibilities. And if you dig into some of these methodologies, you may look at the weights and wonder, well, why is that weighted 4% and that's weighted 10%, for example? Or why are these two categories mutually exclusive, for example? Or why is this category even here and not that category? And so I think for individual folks assessing programs, the right ranking might be an individual choice, because it depends quite a bit on what it is that they care most about and how those outlets are treating those particular measurements. And in some cases, it may be that none of the rankings are helpful, and that students need to dig deeper into the curricula, into the faculty, into other sorts of features of programs to figure out which one is going to best suit their aspirations.
Right. Graham, your students at London Business School have a talent with understanding balance sheets and financial reports. Do you think that they dig in to the methodologies that lie behind the rankings? And is there a caveat there? How important is it to then understand what each of those rankings perhaps is measuring and the weightings that they're using?
I don't think they typically dig in much beyond the headline numbers. I do think in recent years, some of the rankings organizations have been quite clever in that they've produced widgets and various things on their website where you can compose your own ranking using some of the data that underlies it. When you ask about how much weight we put on the individual rankings, I typically hear from colleagues in the US about US news. For those of us outside of the US, we're not ranked in that, so I don't look at that. So which rankings matter to our students? I've seen individual reports that we do with our incoming students, but GMAT, up until about 2012, which is a very long time ago, used to survey the students and ask them to what extent they relied on the different rankings, and ask them to rank the ranking organizations. And I did think that was interesting. And this was before the P&Q composite came out. And very much from an international perspective, the students themselves would say that they used the Financial Times and they used Business Week, as it was back then, now Bloomberg Business Week, and to a lesser extent, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, and Forbes, and some of these rankings that have come by the way. So I thought that was an interesting piece of information to rank the rankings. But I do think over time with QS and P&Q coming along, I don't know where those sit against the different rankings. So I would say that the headline number tends to come across. The other thing that I've observed is, despite a proliferation of rankings that look at lots of different programs, the MBA ranking tends to be used as a proxy for the business school. Even when I talk to clients of our executive education department, and there are bespoke rankings for executive education, they're more likely than not to refer to the MBA ranking. That one sort of has a halo effect around it that sits above the others. And I do find when I talk to the students and ask them what's in the ranking, we have some interesting conversations, because some of them will insist that things are in there that aren't. And then when you actually break it down, they get quite interested in how it breaks down and what matters to them and what doesn't matter to them. So I would encourage anyone listening, don't just take the ranking coordinator's word for how they put the rankings together. What matters to you in that ranking, and can you pick out that subcomponent that's really important? For example, some of the rankings measure aims achieved, the extent to which doing a program at a particular school has helped you pick your individual aims. And as Gabrielle says, that's assigned a random percentage by the ranking organization. Maybe that's the thing that matters more to you, or maybe you're more interested in, does the school teach ESG and sustainability, or does the school have high gender diversity amongst its faculty? But I do think there's a wealth of data out there, and it can be worth getting below the overall assessment of the ranking. And again, I do agree with Gabrielle's point about this kind of ordinal ranking. You know, it might feel like it when you move down from 6th to 8th, but statistically, there's not actually a lot of difference in there. So we celebrate a 2-point increase and commiserate over a 2-point decrease, but actually, it's just noise.
Yeah. Well, as the S of QS and my name on the ranking, I never had that as a career plan. And then my co-host John, who of course started the first what was then Business Week and now Bloomberg Business Week ranking. What have we done? In terms of I mentioned earlier, Mary, John, when he's analyzing these rankings, he gets very agitated about the double-digit increases, decreases, versus Graham saying, hey, you move from 6 to 8, we're still fundamentally the same institution that we were last year. You have achieved this steady improvement in Princeton Review rankings and others. Has that been important to you to be able to show over a period of time that consolidated quality?
It's definitely exciting. I would be lying if I said we weren't excited when the results come out. But you still have to stay focused on the things that you can control, and the things that matter the most, and that's the results and the outcomes that you drive for the students, right? So I think it shows over time that our program serves our particular group of students that want to become leaders really well. And that's what, we love leadership. We want to train leaders. We want to, and we know that, and you know that when you come in here, and the results should speak for themselves. When our students are finish the program, we're looking to different metrics of, has your confidence increased as a leader? Would you recommend the program to a friend? And we're asking this before they leave, right? To make sure that because Jack used to do it. Jack used to meet with them on the way out. We still do that. And to make sure we're doing right by them. And so we use that as, that's more of our North Star than anything else, is really the direct feedback we get from the students as they're getting ready to complete the program, to tell us, to make sure we did the right thing. But we're very excited and grateful to have seen the progress. It's been great.
As warm, charismatic and inspiring as Jack Welch was, if I saw him waiting at the door as I was leaving them, I feel a little bit like the way with Graham, because he's about 6'8". I don't know. I'd head through the kitchens probably. We talked about, Gabrielle, you spoke to the number of metrics in an FT ranking and then different weights allocated. Forbes, now no longer publishing rankings for the last 7 years, kept it very simple. It was, the ROI 5 years out of the program. As you look at some of the metrics, which are the ones perhaps that resonate with you? Salary clearly of interest to candidates, but when you look at GMAT test scores for the US News and implied admission selectivity, which are the ones that you think have genuine resonance?
In my opinion, the better ranking metrics are those that rely on straightforward measurements that can tell you something about, say, like the median student outcome. So median GMAT score or median salary outcome weighted by sector and region, those kinds of things I think are useful. I think it's particularly useful, though, when the schools report these figures directly so that you're getting a full population of reporting that's accounted for. And I think a part of the problem with many of the rankings is that they use these survey mechanisms. And the problem with the survey is there's many problems with surveys. I mean, they may carry selection effects, for example, who responds, who doesn't. We've talked a little bit about statistical significance. So what is the sample size of the respondents and how closely do these score to the scoring cluster when they apply these ordinal ranks, for instance? And then they may also introduce scale bias that reward larger programs or programs with big student populations. And so there's a little bit of a concern around there. There's also questions about like, well, when you survey someone, 5 years out for salary, what is the percentage of the class response rate that you're actually getting? Whereas when students are supplying this information directly for their graduating class, you're hopefully getting, of course, there's some variance, and that's a question as well, but hopefully you should be getting near 100% compliance. We don't see that in all schools, but you ought to be getting near 100% compliance. So you really have a good sense of how these kind of middle students are functioning. And again, median over mean is important because some schools may have really strong entrepreneurship programs. Maybe they've got one or two real high flyers that can distort the mean, or could be a school graduates a lot of people into terrific public sector jobs, but they may be low paying, for instance. And so these kind of things I think you've got to really be thinking about when you're interpreting some of this data. Well, I mean, I can give lots of examples, but I don't want to take up too much time.
Well, I will stay with you, Gabrielle, if I may, because, with Bruce Delmonico and the rest of the team at Yale, from applying, going through the 2-year program at Yale, and then, of course, it's not just that first position as they come out of any of your schools, but, the impact of the MBA in the 5, 15, 25, 35 years beyond. When you look at LinkedIn's approach and presumably a base of hundreds of millions, if they choose, that they've tried to look at career progression. They don't necessarily have salary in there, but they've got other measures. Do you find that that's an interesting metric to take a look at, or are you a little cynical?
I would say both. I mean, I both find it interesting. I think they have an interesting data set that, as from a research perspective, I think could be really interesting to dig into, but a little bit cynical in the sense that I think some of the evaluation of progress that they're doing is a little bit dependent on their product and how folks use their product with respect to like networking and connecting. I mean, I can't say that I fully understand the methodology, so I don't want to dig too deep, but I guess it would raise questions about, was there any kind of conflict of interest with respect to the methodology that they put together and promotion of their products? I'm not sure, maybe not, but it would be good for them to be really explicit about how they do their measurements and to identify any kinds of conflicts of interest that may exist and what sort of biases, whether it's scale bias or some other sort of bias that is built into the methodology.
Right. Graham, you've spoken about a GMAT report that now goes back in terms of which rankings perhaps candidates were looking at, the MBA that dominates in that conversation. What about alumni in all of this equation? How important is that performance in a ranking important to that stakeholder group?
Well, there's not a lot of noise if you move from 6 to 8. But if you make a bigger jump, there will be an awful lot of noise for the alumni, and that can be positive celebration if you're lucky enough to be ranked number 1, as London Business School has been 2 or 3 times, and it can also be go the other way if you drop out of the top 10 and the alumni hub. But I think my favorite measure in all of the rankings is one that's no longer published, and it's another one from the FT, and it was called Alumni Recommend. It was one of the little columns in the middle of the ranking. I think it had 3 or 4% weight, I don't recall, but everyone assumed that it was what did your alumni say about their experience at your school, which is actually what it is now. But up until about 2002, it was the question that was asked was, to which schools would you go to recruit MBA talent? And they discounted your own school. So it was, if you like, a market measure of what did alumni of top business schools think of other schools. And over the 20 years that the FT published that measure, it was the single most stable measure over that time. In a previous life, I used to work as an advisor to deans and business schools. And I would say, look, do you know what? That's the one I would pin on the back of the dean's door, because that's what the world is saying about your program, not what your own alumni are saying, which can be shaped by their love for the school and the things that you do. But this is a admittedly imperfect market perception of how schools are doing. And I was gutted when the FT dropped that 3 or 4 years ago, because I thought that was a very, very interesting market-driven, stable measure. And in some ways, although it was only weighted at a very low percentage, to me that was a very important, as an alum of a business school, that's one that I cared about. And I think boards and deans should look at that very carefully. And I wish they would bring it back if I had my wish.
Graham, but both of us remember this from 2002. I'm starting to worry that we've been in this industry too long and we should just retire and go fly fishing or something else. But we'll leave that note on the Dean's door. There is another metric in the FT ranking, and Mary, I'd love your input on this one. Right at the end of the table, it talks about overall satisfaction, which you touched upon earlier. And so I think it's on a scale of 10, but it has no weight in the FT ranking. And yet it's an intrinsically interesting piece of feedback from students from across all of these institutions across the world. As you internally look to measure overall satisfaction, outcomes, presumably you don't ask them this question when they're about to take a big accounting exam in the month of January. But what is the feedback that you really look for from students to know if you're doing a good job?
We obsess over feedback, right? So, even a few weeks ago, I talked with students in the capstone course, and I asked them the question about, tell us about a time when things went right and success stories, and give us feedback on what's working and what's not working. And one of the things that we talk about is what success looks like for the student, right? So, the ranking is a snapshot, but it's not a story. Each student has their story, and understanding for you as a student what success means. If I am a working adult, maybe building my confidence by the time I'm done with the program. It might be a raise or promotion during the program. Or very often I have students say, I learned what great leadership looks like and I left my job and I took a new job. Or I got to entrepreneurship class and I realized I'm an entrepreneur. I'm going to bring my project to life and figure it out. And it's not always, the same thing for everyone. Some of our students, since we have mostly adult learners, many of them want to complete the degree as an example for their children or grandchildren even, right? And so understanding what satisfaction for each student means is very, very different. And then working with them personally to try to bring that to life is what matters, I think, the most. And so we survey students in the class, we read them. I actually still read them. We used to read them with Jack, and we do what's called a NPS survey, where Net Promoter Score, would you be willing to recommend your professor? So we do this for faculty and we do this for the program. And we get feedback every quarter from students and we categorize it, analyze it to look to see where there's possibility for improvement, whether that's dealing with your advisor or dealing with your course or the program itself. If I have enough students tell us that a book is terrible, we're going to reassess that book and talk to the faculty member, right? And so, we really, I think that that's a big part of our DNA, and trying to make sure that students are forgiving. They give you grace when they know you're listening and you're working to make change, and during that journey they see changes happen as a result of their feedback. That's what it's about in the end. So but we do at the end of their journey talk to them about it to make sure, and also understand where the times where we get it wrong, to try to keep continuously improve.
Well, with those net promoter scores, before we went live, we talked about ranking not just the faculty and the programs, but maybe the deans and the associate deans need to be included in that list. We'll see where that takes us.
You
But we
never
have talked
know.
about different stakeholder groups, and Gabrielle, we were talking earlier about alumni. What about employers in all of this? Do you think that rankings meaningfully influence how employers will view MBA talent from different schools?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can completely confidently answer this question. What I suspect is on the margins, perhaps these rankings matter with particular firms, but there's got to be many other factors that firms are looking at that are much more central to their hiring practices, like employer by employer. So it could be what is their history with the school, observations of performance, alumni in leadership roles, certain aspects of the curriculum or geography or scale that are a good fit for their recruiting or for the firm. So I suspect there are lots of things that employers consider. To be honest, I doubt that rankings are top of that list. And I suspect actually, to the extent that they were at one time, that's probably less true today, given new sensibilities about where to find talent.
Right. London Business School, Graham, is of course a target for many top recruiters. McKinsey, Bain, BCG, they don't go to every school to recruit. Is that more a reflection of the candidates that they're hiring that prove to be so successful in their organizations?
Yeah, I think top recruiters choose top schools. The firms that you mentioned and others will have a list of schools from which they recruit. It doesn't mean that they're not open to talent from all schools, but they will have an A list that they visit regularly and nurture the relationship and have people within the firms. The more general question on what do recruiters think of rankings is ran a workshop many years ago at IMD, another great European business school, and I was privileged enough to run a workshop for recruiters there. And we went round the table and we asked recruiters, did rankings matter to them when they were selecting schools? And to a person, they said, no, absolutely, rankings don't matter. And then what we did was we split them up into groups with other recruiters, groups of 3 or 4, and we asked them to devise a recruitment strategy for an imaginary firm. They were all HR professionals, and we said, you've now been hired. Within 2 minutes, every single group had mentioned the word rankings. Every single group, when they were faced with a blank piece of paper to set up a recruiting strategy for an imaginary firm, had used the word rankings at least once. So it was really interesting that, when you don't have that knowledge and history of working with a school for years and with some of our recruiters for decades, and you're starting from scratch, then the rankings are like they are for candidates, they're an obvious source of information. I think the other thing about the way that they use them, and I've also experienced this with candidates, is they use rankings not to make their final selection, but to create shortlists. So if you say to a recruiter, they might say, well, we want to recruit from a top 10 school in the Midwest, or we want to recruit from a top 5 school in Asia, or a top 20 European school, which means there's a big difference between 20 and 21 or 10 and 11, much more than there is going, say, between 20 and 19 or 10 and 9. But the final decision, especially amongst candidates, comes down to much more of a personal fit. And I guess that's good because, our students are rational people, and I'm glad that they're not basing the ultimate decision on rankings. So yeah, what recruiters say and what they do was really quite different in that. And we had a lot of laughter with the recruiters when we explained to them what we've been doing.
I can picture you in Lausanne just quietly shaking your head as they'd all written the ranking on this blank piece of paper. And with that, and with rational candidates, who of course, Mary, are making this significant investment in their time, in their finances, to do their MBA. Is there something about business school rankings, MBA rankings, that you wish prospective students knew, or a way of looking at them?
I think they need to dig deep, right? I wish they need to dig a little bit deeper, understand, the methodology, but really, think about which MBA is going to suit my needs, right, in life. Like, well, is it about accelerating my career? Is it about the experience? Is it about getting that first job? Or is it about affordability and flexibility, and being part of a community. Do I want to be in person? Do I want to be online? I mean, there's a lot of aspects to consider when you're thinking about what program is right for me. So it's just one data point, but really, rankings are, they're just really a headline. So the student success is the main story, and they just need to figure out what they want their story to be and pick the place that's going to suit both their needs financially, from a flexibility standpoint, and impact and results are the only thing that matter, for that student at the end of the day. But my advice to them is make it, take the time to dig deep and take the time to be curious about the experience every school offers, to understand whether or not it's a fit for you and what you want to get from it. So use the rankings, but talk to alumni, check them out on LinkedIn, and do your homework. And don't be afraid to pick up the phone and talk to people who've been there to see if it's truly a fit. It's a big investment, and you want to make sure that it's right for you and your family.
Yeah. We love lists, Gabrielle, whether it's the 10 best dressed in Hollywood or the 5 best Italian restaurants in New Haven. It sort of simplifies things for people. You could probably run rings around me, talk about Z scores and statistical outliers, I've no doubt. But your breakdown, things that you would want an MBA candidate to understand about rankings that you think would be really valuable to them.
Yeah, I think, piggybacking on Graham's insights around employers' view of the rankings, I kind of have a similar thought about or feeling about how students ought to be thinking, or candidates ought to be thinking about the ranking. I mean, rankings are maybe pretty good actually at providing some loose guide to overall quality of MBA programs. And so, there they could be like a helpful signal, but as we pointed out before, the differences between, 6 and 8, or even 8 and 19, or however far you want to spread it, is probably a lot less important than, as Mary said, prospective students thinking deeply about their own goals for learning and leading to help determine the place that's going to best help them achieve their aims. I think, Matt, you mentioned that the FT actually does a little survey on this, on aims achieved. I forget whether it was Graham or Matt that mentioned that, but it's funny you mentioned that, because that's one I always dial into myself. I'm very interested in what alums have to say about their experience in retrospect of our program and how that helped achieve their goals. And I think that's actually a very important signal, in the sense that people have very different goals, and schools' jobs are to support those aspirations rather than direct those aspirations. And so I think that's a valuable measurement to look at.
Well, let me stay with you and my box of electronics, which has the first iPod, but I'll go further back to when I used to have a graphic equalizer on my hi-fi system, Gabrielle. And so I could adjust, the bass and the treble for the music that I liked. As you look at all of those metrics, are there perhaps 2 or 3 that you think are of greater value and that you'd increase the volume on that one? This is a festival, after all.
So I think what would be useful, and something that you alluded to before, but I haven't really had the chance to play around with or see, is a DIY ranking system where people can go, where candidates and students and others can go in and take a look at all of the different dials. And so long as those dials are based on like large sample data and not small sample data or odd weights, I think there's a lot of noise to be subtracted from the methodologies. We can go deep into that. I also think that there ought to be better governance over the rankings with standing advisory boards from deans and programs to help like better align these rankings methodologies with real practice. But those criticisms aside, I think it would be interesting to take those things that are available and available in high quality, those data points that are available in high quality, and create some sort of way for students and candidates to kind of like take a little quiz and do it themselves, or move the dials themselves to determine a set that might be worth looking at. It should never be definitive and probably never be ordinal. But a set of recommendations based on their specific needs, aspirations, goals, etc., that can help direct them to. There are many high quality business MBA programs out there, many high quality that are above, a bar for excellence, a high bar for excellence. And so, what students and candidates need, I think, are tools to assess that landscape, especially when you're looking at the global level, and try to sort out which maybe brand is very important to them and they want to dial that up, but that's an individual decision. And I think it ought to be made by the candidates.
Right. So there's an invitation, Graham, to Friday Street and the FT offices. You're the chief editor for the day. You can do what you want. And you look at the rankings. And as we think about Business Week from close to 40 years ago, the FT that started in 1999, all of them began with a list of 100 schools. And the simple reality of that was how much space they had in a physical magazine or in a broadsheet newspaper. There wasn't room for 101, at least that's what they were decided. But now we live in a world of digital visualization. So beyond what 100, what are other ways that you might look at representing rankings, to break out some of the results and draw attention to some of these different themes?
Yeah, so I'm conscious that there are now rankings that go beyond 100. There are some of the new rankings would rank literally hundreds of universities and give bandings within those hundreds. But you talked earlier about a graphic equalizer, and I'm conscious that many in our audience will have no idea what the graphic
Scratching
equalizer
their
is.
head.
I very proudly used to have one in my car at one stage. But for the modern generation, if they're thinking about their AI engine and what would Graham turn up on the AI engine, I think it would be a couple of things that, Mary talked about the aims achieved. To what extent have the students from that school achieved their aims, which is one in the FT ranking. I'd also go for the one that I mentioned earlier, my old favorite of what do other schools' alumni say about my school? And then there'd be a third one that I don't think, and you, Matt, you've got the knowledge, you may know this, there isn't one. I would want one that said, what is the largest percentage of students, the largest nationality of students in the class? Because one of the things that I really think sets some of the international schools aside is the fact that everyone's in a minority. And what I mean by that is the largest cohort of students in our class at London Business School is not Brits. In fact, it's Indians, and we have roughly 15% Indians on our MBA, and in our graduate master programs, it tends to be 16% Chinese. And why does that matter? It's because I think when a class has 60, 70, 80% of any one nationality, that determines the culture and the norms in that classroom. And I think one of the real values that I would look for is that truly global experience. And therefore, I'd want all of the nationalities to be small enough that none of them dominated. So the third button in my magic graphic equalizer AI engine would be this. I think it's probably an inverse correlation, but what's the largest nationality, and is it below 20% of the class, so that everyone in my study group is going to have a different background and experience. So those would be my three.
So just to be clear on that last one, Graham, so that your school isn't always coming second to a school in Luxembourg, because when a country is particularly small, the chances are that 99% of the students will come from outside of that country. So is there a nuance to how you would look? You have the world in your classroom and how you
No, it's really important. It's not the number of students that are not from your country. That is actually measured by several of the rankings. It's the number of students in the largest national group in the class.
Got it.
So for us, the largest national group might be India with 15%, perhaps North America with 12%, China with 10%. The point is that no group, whether it's from your country or not from your country, is larger than a number that would mean every study group could be different. So it's not the total number of non-nationals in the class. It's the size of the largest cohort in the class. And by the way, I'd want it to be as small as possible. I'd never want it to be, I'd want it to be somewhere between 15 and 20%. It's not a comment on which nationality. I don't mind which nationality it is. It's just having that diversity so that everyone is in a minority.
Mm. I'm going to go back to Gabriel on this one because, of course, within the United States and 360 million people, you typically will have 65% US domestic students in the program, but across a big country with a lot of diversity of experience. So, is there a counter to what Graham says that, having that large base of US students in the Yale classroom is nevertheless creating tremendous diversity of perspectives?
I don't think that there's a contrary point. I think it's just a complementary point in the sense like there are different dimensions of which to measure diversity. So it could be background. I mean, the U.S. is a very large country, so we have quite a bit of diversity within the different regions. There's income diversity, there's sector diversity from which students come. There's lots of different sorts of diversity. So I think something like that actually is quite important because what it really gets at is it's a measure of the different kind of numbers of cultural and human perspectives that people might be exposed to in their time. And in a kind of a global world, this is critically important. And so I think you might just want to be careful about the categories that you craft for measuring such a thing. But I think it's actually quite a nice idea to have some holistic measurement of perspective diversity within an MBA program, which I think is very important for our mission of educating leaders for business and society.
Yeah, and both of you witnessed these lively, engaged discussions in the classroom of all of these different viewpoints that really brings whatever you're teaching alive.
I would just like add to that, like some of the devil with these kinds of things are in the details. Like, how do you measure these kinds of, what is the right measurement for who's international and who's not? Is it that they hold this, characteristic or this quality? And so, sorting through those details is pretty important, but the overall idea of diversity measurement in a holistic fashion, I think is quite nice.
Right, and perhaps as Graham said, in this AI-driven world, we can break out all of those results that will be so important to certain candidates and not just rely on the ordinal numbers that fit on a page. Graham was very old style. He would pin a note on the dean's door, Mary, with the thing that he wanted to draw to the dean's attention. So if there's a note on your door, as
Yes.
the dean of JWMI, what would it say around rankings? What's the one thing that you would want to see on that note about rankings?
I think from a relevancy standpoint, I was thinking about your question earlier in terms of how that works in an online environment for JWMI. And, I think when looking at our program and thinking about rankings, we're thinking about faculty, we're thinking about content, right? And then, and student satisfaction. And so, really, what is it saying about your faculty? How much, and emphasis on faculty is extremely important. They're the heart and soul of everything within our MBA program, and part of what makes it unique is the hiring process for faculty. So, what type of real world experience do your faculty have versus maybe research? And for in the business world for our students, that's a big alignment with our mission. So the emphasis on who are the faculty, how are they hired, and what do students say about the faculty, I think is extremely important and something that we watch over, as well as content and relevancy. So what materials are they looking at? Does it matter? Are CEOs looking at those same materials? Are they up to date? Are you continuously improving? And then student satisfaction. Those are the three things that we watch, and I think it's going to be that way for a little while.
Well, I think it's only fair to ask ourselves at the end of a very insightful session, how did we do? How did we rank in the past 50 minutes? I'll invite candidates into the green room, into the lobby of the Centre Court Festival so that you can obviously share your perspectives. I write about this quite a lot. I got a lot of noise projecting that perhaps a future FT ranking, there may not be any US schools, of course, rankings. They're great for subject. And to have this level of thoughtful depth, I think for candidates, what you've shared in the last 50 minutes is of immense value. It places it within this wider picture and really thinking about schools, their cultures, and what's going to align with you as a candidate. And that's immensely, immensely valuable to catch for the Centre Court viewers. So, Mary, Graham, Gabrielle, thank you for spending the last 50 minutes talking rankings with all of us. It was a great session. Thanks very much.